Hi, I'm Dan Parent from Archie Comics. I'm an artist and writer, and I've worked on all the properties from Archie to Betty and Veronica, Jughead. And you're watching Sequentially Yours.
Hey, this is Sequentially Yours, initially mine. This is a show where we look at this week's number ones and tell you which ones you'll remember forever and which ones you will forget tomorrow. Oh, do we have a selection this week. Such a selection. Let's jump right into it, and you'll see. Alright. So we are going to start with, from Titan Comics, Sherlock number 1, A Study in Pink. Yes, this is not only a comic of a 6-year-old episode of a television show, and arguably the worst episode since the characters have actually gotten better over time, and we've liked them better. It's a manga. It's a manga that was published quite some time ago, and that is actually available for free online because of that, with various fan translations and whatnot. But the official one is now done by Titan Comics, and oh, this is so lazy. So much so that even though it's manga style and therefore reads right to left, manga style, the numbering is on the back apparently, because the people at Titan Comics couldn't be bothered to put the front of the comic on what was essentially the front of the comic. As to the story, it is the same story, almost line for line, and almost shot for shot in certain places. The difference is that the visual things that they did to make A Study in Pink and the Sherlock franchise interesting have been eliminated and replaced with standard manga tropes. This may be the most boring thing I have read in quite some time, because I saw that episode. I saw it several times when I thought it was really good, in showing people Sherlock 6 years ago. Since then, it's become one of my least favorite episodes because other ones have shown up to make it better. So, boring episode, plus unimaginative presentation, plus sheer laziness in publication. Bye. Sorry, Titan. That was a waste. I don't know what they were doing. Let's move on. Dread. This is actually a 2-part sequel to The Good Movie, the Carl Urban movie. And actually, I like it. It's got all of the kind of standard Dread, tropes to it. It is presented in the right style. It is well written, interestingly paced. The pacing is really good. But more to the point, it presents a somewhat unique mystery to solve. It is mostly a police procedural with Judge Dredd. But you know what? That's fine. I don't mind that. I think that's actually kind of fascinating. And what they're setting up here, it's part 1 of 2, so I've only seen the first half, but the first half set up an interesting story, something that I buy into, something that I want to find out what happens next. And that does not always happen with A, Dredd, which I like Dredd, but it can be touch and go, or B, comics in general, especially 1 of 2. I don't really know what else to say about it other than it's worth reading. The story is it's unique to the Dredd universe, but it's also universal enough to understand. Essentially, there is a sandstorm that blows radiated sand in from the Cursed Earth to Mega City 1, and during that time, people are murdered. Specific people are murdered, and it's obvious that these people have been murdered for a reason. And Dredd is on the case, along with his partner. It works out well. Honestly, yeah, if you like Dredd, Dust is the book. Give it a shot. It's worth reading. Next. Prometheus. Alright, I like Dan Abnett. I really like his work in general, and this is no exception. The Life and Death series, while this is technically a number 1, it's part 5 of a 17-part story called Life and Death among the Dark Horse alien universe stuff. The first 4 parts were a Predator one that I was lazy and did not do a initially mine that week on, but it was okay. The Prometheus one actually is a little bit more interesting. It picks up right where the Predator one left off. You do not have to read the Predator one in order to get this. They give you enough information. But essentially you have a lot of colonial marines that were on a ship that until now was had 2 predators on it. They're both dead. We see them kind of, their bodies under sheets. But during the firefight with the last one of the colonial marines shot at a coffin-like thing, and when they go to investigate, it opens up, and inside is one of the engineers. And now the engineer is our new monster that they are introducing to this universe that already has xenomorphs and predators in it. And I like this idea, actually, a lot. This particular engineer is terrifying. He is different from the other 2 monsters. The way that he approaches things is they keep describing him as a god, and I could almost see that godlike quality in the sense that he does not care about the things in front of him. If they get in his way, he will stop them. But otherwise, he has a plan. We don't know what that plan is, but it essentially involves starting up the ship that they're on and going someplace. It is really well put together. The art is excellent. Andrea Muti? Yeah, Andrea Muti, Mutti, as per usual. Sorry about the pronunciations. Colors by Rain Barreto. Rain Barreto does an amazing job. So check out some of these colors here. I mean, that's just the first page, but it's muted, so it gives you enough atmosphere for this type of world, but it also pops where it needs to pop, and that's one of the things I really like about this comic. I enjoyed the concept. I really would like to see more engineers in this world and see what they can do with this new monster, since a lot of Predator and Alien books have gotten to be repetitive. I mentioned in a previous episode how much I liked Alien's Defiance. We have changed it from survival horror to a race against the clock. Yeah, I really liked Alien Defiance. In fact, I just got the 2nd issue, I think a week or 2 ago, and I read it. It's excellent. I'm really liking that, but mostly because it's a different take on the Aliens stories. And this seems like they could actually do something really good with it, and Abnett is, again, an excellent writer, somebody who I'm really glad to see working on this. So yeah, Prometheus, worth the read. Okay, so I have been sitting on this since Wednesday night when I read this rant. So bear with me here, because we're going to get through this together. Wacky Raceland. Okay, so DC has the Hanna-Barbera licenses right now, and they have been slowly bringing out stuff within the Hanna-Barbera universe, trying out new things, throwing stuff at the wall, seeing what sticks. Recently, I actually chose as the number 1 for the week, I believe. This is actually really kind of cool. Okay. One of their things that basically is taking all of their adventure stories and combining them into one world with Johnny Quest and Space Ghost and Birdman and Frankenstein Jr. and the Herculoids, all that. And I loved that. I thought that was really well done. So, imagine my surprise when I get Wacky Raceland. I'm thinking, Wacky Races. Okay, what are we going to do with this? How is this going to be interesting or different? And it's different, I'll say that much. Interesting? It is a gritty reboot of Wacky Races. In case you don't know, Wacky Races was a show that lasted from 68 to 69, a slapstick comedy. It seemed to be based on it's kind of based on the 1965 The Great Race, which if you haven't seen is an excellent, excellent film. And basically it is just about a bunch of Hanna-Barbera characters, not people that you haven't really seen in a lot of other stuff. They were brand new for the series, going on various races around the world. There's 2 races per episode, half-hour episodes. Dirk Dastardly and Muttley are probably the ones who are the most popular ones characters that have moved out from there. Although Penelope Pitstop ended up giving her own show at one point, The Perils of Penelope Pitstop, and the Anthill Mob were supporting characters on that. So, when I saw this as a gritty reboot of it, I was floored. Now, I am not opposed. I want to make this very clear. I am not opposed to the idea that you can take a silly concept like Wacky Racers and make it more serious. Put some stakes to it. Give it something worth watching about, caring about. But this goes to such lengths to make it dark and grimy and unlikable. These characters are basically homicidal maniacs, all of them. They are ugly, and not just physically, but they're presented as being ugly. The concepts are purely about shock value and not really about creating interesting characters. It is the worst of the Dark Age of comics vomited onto Hanna-Barbera. To call it cheap would be an insult to dollar store batteries and $350 late model coupes that you find on Craigslist. To call it lazy would be incorrect, because, quite frankly, laziness would involve just transferring the story with all of its flaws and all of its strengths to a new concept. But it doesn't just do that. It manages to seek out all of the strengths and bury them under crap. It manages to take any opportunity it can for a 90s style, let's shock 'em to shock 'em approach with only the lightest touch on depth. But it wants you to think that it is deep. It wants you to think that it is finally taking this seriously. But it's not. It's instead taking all of the worst comic tropes and mixing it with the worst aspects of a fair to mediocre cartoon. Penelope Pitstop, for example. Penelope Pitstop from Wacky Races. Now, let's look at Penelope Pitstop from Wacky Raceland. So, we've gone from reasonably dressed Southern Belle to skin-tight pink outfit with boob socks. Lovely. Here's one of my favorites. In Wacky Races, one of the characters was the Red Max, who was clearly a Red Baron parody, and he had a car that was also a biplane and could fly in a limited way. He has now been changed to the Red Baron, which, fine, I assume that most of the people reading this are not going to be familiar with the cartoon, and more to the point, they're not going to be hung up on this. I'm not. I don't care that they changed the name. So he's just the Red Baron now. But there's a page in which he's talking about Aryan goddesses and the Fuhrer. Who's the writer on this? Pontak? What is your name? I can't even find the person's name right now. It's in here someplace, but you realize that World War I and World War II were different wars, right? Like, there's a reason why we have distinguished the numbers. It's not like one was another chapter or another episode of the same war. That the Red Baron and biplanes were from World War I, like 20 years before there was a Fuhrer. That making him a Nazi makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, I'm guessing the target audience of this will soon be playing Battlefield 1 and learn that World War I was its own separate war, so perhaps you should have thought of that. He also spends a little bit of time talking to Private Meekly, who apparently is a trans woman, a post-op trans woman, which normally I am all for representation for minorities and especially trans people because they have so little representation in comics, but you know what? Maybe try writing the dialogue in such a way that's not horrendously awkward. Just maybe. And I we could talk about something about this character that isn't their genitals. I know, shocking. Now, this is not to say that everything in here is terrible. There's some things I like. Dirk Dastardly is kind of a cool design. Instead of his silly hats with the goggles, he still has the goggles, but instead he has sort of dreadlocks that have been colored, and that's not a bad design. Muttley, on the other hand, is a cybernetic dog. Another thing. Part of what made Wacky Races work and what made cartoons from that period work, people like to talk about cartoons from that period and stuff from that period, about how daring they were. We could never do that today. They weren't that daring. For example, Lazy Luke is in the cartoon, it is implied very heavily that the reason why he is lazy is that because he's drunk. Especially since he puts liquid in the pot-bellied stove on his car, and it gives him a temporary boost before it all explodes. It's a running joke of the series. Wacky Raceland has decided that subtlety is for suckers, and that's why Lazy Luke is just a fall-down drunk, and we get to see how he became so in a backup story at the back, where we learn about him and Blubber Bear, who was originally a bear, and is now his friend that was murdered by a bear and then brought back to life by the narrator or the announcer of the Wacky Races, who has brought everybody together for this, but is now wearing the bear skin, even though his skin was kind of torn apart by the bear. He's now wearing the bear skin on him like a coat with the head here. And he's called Blubber Bear. That's a thing now. It's... this is just an ugly book. I would not be surprised if pretty soon we get at least one since there's two characters that are lumberjack themed. I'm putting my money down on this that at one point somebody's getting cut in half, like buzzsaw right through their middle, or their head decapitated. Somebody's getting cut through their body by the end of this book. Not this particular book, but this series. The Anthill Mob, I wasn't sure who they were at first. Penelope was having a fight with somebody, and they show a panel of these creatures that look sort of like, well, let's see, what's the best way to put it? Rejects from a 70s birth horror film. I mean, this is what happens when you mix the DNA of General Zod and that nightmare where your brain is eating you from the inside out. Why are these the Anthill Mob? I don't know. Yeah, the sheer length this has gone to make itself seem adult is just absolutely mind-bending. And as a result, it comes out as just an ugly, terrible approach to this. And again, this is not me saying that DC is doing terribly with these franchises. They're not. Obviously, because I liked at least one of them, but this was just a terrible misstep. I mean, what's next? Flintstones Noir? Stanley Kubrick's The Jetsons? Are we going to see George Jetson with a Ludovico treatment? I don't even know what to do with this. I spent most of it, and those who watch Cinematically Hours, Debbie, I was sitting there next to her, and I just kept going like this as I'm reading it. Because I was trying so hard to wake myself up. I could not believe I was reading this. It's just... here, I opened up to the terrifying Anthill Mob. Brace yourselves, people. Look at that. What is that? Ugh. I'm guessing the guys with 3 heads are the gruesome twosome? Because irony? I don't even know. I don't know what's up with this. It's like if you took a Hanna-Barbera cartoon, mixed it with Tim Minear's short-lived but excellently done show Drive, and then made it as terrible as you possibly could. Ugh! So you want to know what won? Do you? Do you want to know? Of course you do. I want to know what won too. Alright, what won? We're done with that one. Let's clear our mind and let's talk about the winner for this week, which is Merry Men. Alright, let's just skip ahead. Merry Men is Robin Hood if Robin Hood's Merry Men were gay. It's not a terrible book, and it's my winner for this week. I think it's the best number one this week, but I'm going to qualify that a little bit. So, here's what works about it. The characters are all likable. They're all introduced quickly and easily, even if you don't really know a lot about the Robin Hood myth, and it does introduce characters who are kind of rarely used from the myth. Alan a Dale, for example, or Daniel of Doncaster. You still get the idea pretty quickly. It's, as per usual, one of my things with a number one is that it needs to give a complete story in the first issue, something that we can hold on to. And it does that in here. Essentially, Robin gets talked into liberating a city. This is early in his career where he's just bothering the sheriff rather than actively fighting him. This is sort of him being pushed into actively joining this war against the Sheriff of Nottingham. The characters are well developed and very, very likable. I really fell into all of them. And of course, as somebody who likes queer representation, I love that there is not only a lot of queer characters in here, but a lot of different queer characters. There are some gay characters, there are some bi characters, there's at least one trans character, and the dialogue between them is all very natural, very well presented. We get who they are without having to be introduced to that aspect of them. That being said, it can and does get really, really lecture-y at some points. Like, I understand the metaphor. I understand the metaphor. You're living in the forest and you're outside of society because you're queer, and that's not necessarily accepted. I get it. You don't need to give me a page and a half or at 1.2 pages worth of Alan a Dale narrating this to me. It's just, I don't need that. I understand. You can trust me as a reader to do that. That being said, when Robin is doing what Robin Hood does, it's great. There's sword fights and sneaking around and plots and plans and bows and arrows and all of that stuff. It all exists within the context of this story. And so it's good to see, a Robin Hood story with this additional component. I wish that they would not make the additional component, though, an excuse to lecture the audience. We don't need to be lectured. We need to see these characters in a setting that is worthwhile. The art itself is actually nice. I love the coloring. It's nice and bright. It's, the characters have a slight cartoony quality to them, but not enough that it feels like it needs over-the-top cartoony movements and reactions. There are... the backgrounds are good. The running jokes work really well, and again, feel natural. It feels like the characters are bouncing off one another. Essentially, when the characters have somebody to talk to, they're great. When they only have the audience to talk to, that's when it falls apart. Another thing that I like that's kind of interesting is that they're focusing very heavily on the Norman conquest, which happened obviously before Robin Hood, but still had a big impact on the world in which the character Robin Hood would have lived, if he existed, which he didn't. But the Norman conquest of England was a big, important event. It basically kicked out the Saxons, who had kicked out the British several years before. And, Saxons were feeling essentially the same oppression that they had visited upon their British counterparts when they did it. So that is a kind of constant undertone to the story with this sort of political changeover that is happening in England at the time. And it works. It works a lot. And that was, in a way, instrumental in the signing of the Magna Carta years later. And, the granting of actual rights to the people by the king. Also, I like, it seems to have a queer history of England just as text stuff in here. Just talking about, actual queer people out of history that were a part of this world. Which, yeah, that's great. Comics should be, to a certain extent, educational. And not just for children, but for adults too. So, yeah, clearly a lot was put into this. The only thing... hold on. The writer is Robert Rohde, illustration by Jackie Lewis, colored by Marissa Louise. Yeah. So, it works out really well. I think that this has a lot of potential. I think that the writing needs to stop being in love with itself, needs to back off a little bit on its metaphor, and just let us understand what's happening. Once it does that, I think we've got a real good comic here out of Oni Press, and this could be a real hit. I'm going to keep reading it just out of curiosity to see what happens with it, and see if it gets any better. It's, right now, a whole lot of not bad. And it has the potential to be really great. Let's just hope that they manage to make it happen. Alright. So, that was it for this week. I obviously got a little upset about one of these comics, and yeah, that's going to happen. And we're allowed to. But on the other hand, we had a pretty decent run. Just the stuff that wasn't good really wasn't good, and the stuff that was good was okay. That's going to happen every week. Yes, there were several Rebirth titles. Yes, I've read them. No, I'm not going to include them here, just because they sort of, again, and if I have enough stuff to work with, I would prefer to avoid the big two, just because they have so much more working for them and going on for them. And, if I'm going to do the big two, I'm going to do not the superhero titles, and certainly not the Rebirth titles, which are getting all the attention right now. What I will say is that of the Rebirth titles, Aquaman, Flash, and Wonder Woman was my favorite. I thought it had the most potential, but all three were very, very good. Aquaman was, I believe, Dan Abnett's, and brilliantly written. I'm not going to go into the kind of twist at the end, but I had to read it twice in order to, because it changed, when you know what happens at the end, it changes the tone of everything that was written. It was really kind of cool. And Flash ties into the main Rebirth book that we already saw in a good way. I liked them, so read them. Alright, so it's time to go over the oddly incongruous. I might change that because I'm having trouble saying incongruous. However you pronounce it. The oddly incongruous theme for the week. And the oddly incongruous theme for the week is licensed properties. Seriously, with the exception of the Rebirth titles, yeah, this week all the number ones were either licensed or, in the case of Robin Hood, in the public domain, and therefore would have had to have been licensed if it was not, a legend that anybody can play with. So, yeah. And again, sometimes that happens. Licensed titles. Not all the time does everything have to be original. Sometimes you get a really good license, and sometimes you get a lazy replay of Sherlock. Alright, so I don't know what your opinion is going to be of this week's comics, but these were initially mine. Take care.